Hey guys, thanks for tuning in today. Today we're going to start our study of the plant kingdom. If you remember, over the last few months, we've talked about the bacteria kingdoms. We just finished up talking about the protist and the fungi kingdoms, and now we're going to move on to what I like to consider the two largest kingdoms of living things, the plant kingdom and then the animal kingdom. I'm hopeful in that the animal kingdom will be able to do face-to-face in room 405 as we normally would, but the plant kingdom is something that we're going to be doing virtually. So hopefully you'll be able to understand everything you need to understand about plants, and if not, please feel free to email me at any time to ask me any questions. Okay? All right, with that, let's start talking about plants. If I ask you to name for me some plants, what would be some of the things that would come to mind? Of course, you're probably all sitting there thinking, well, duh, Mrs. Young, trees and flowers and grass and bushes. And the answer is you're correct. Okay, those are all types of plants, and those are the more common types of plants that we would think of. However, there are other types of plants that people don't usually think of as being plants, things such as moss, ferns, and green algae. Okay, if you remember when we talked about protists, we talked a little bit about the green algae, and I have explained to you that at one time, green algae was classified as plants, and then for a brief period of time, the green algae was taken out and classified as protists instead of plants. And then the green algae was put back into the plant kingdom. So even though we've already talked about green algae, as we were talking about the red algae and the brown algae with the protists, I want you to please be aware of the fact that green algae is, in fact, a member of the plant kingdom. Okay? Well, what is it that makes green algae? What is it that makes trees, grass, flowers, etc., classified as plants? Well, plants have some general characteristics. Okay? First of all, plants have eukaryotic cells. All right? That means that all plant cells have a membrane-bound nucleus and organelles. Plants are solely autotrophic. They are photosynthetic. They rely on the sun. They make their own food. Okay, if you remember talking about bacteria, we said that there are bacteria that are autotrophic. There's bacteria that are heterotrophic. We talked about protists, that there are protists that are autotrophic, protists, that are heterotrophic. We talked about fungi. Fungi are solely heterotrophic. Well, plants are solely autotrophic. And hopefully you remember maybe from Bio 1 class or even chemistry class that photosynthesis is a chemical reaction that takes place in the chloroplasts of plant cells. And it is a chemical equation that includes sunlight plus carbon dioxide plus water yields glucose and oxygen. Plant cells have cell walls made of cellulose. If you remember when we talked about cells, we reviewed the cells back in the beginning of the year, we talked about that. And cellulose is a polysaccharide. It's one of our complex carbohydrates. Cellulose is what makes plants rigid and what makes them stand tall and erect. If you think of having a stalk of celery, which is actually a stem of a plant, by the way, but if you think of taking a stalk of celery and breaking it in half, it's crispy. Okay, that's because of the cellulose. Plants are non-motile, which means that plants cannot move from point A to point B by themselves. Now, do plants move? We talked about this before. Do plants move? The answer is yes. They move, but they're not motile. They move because they will move with the sunlight. They will bend towards the sunlight. And I remember joking with you guys and saying, if you're ever really bored one day, you can park yourself out in your backyard on a nice sunny day in a chair. And you can sit and do your schoolwork, and you can literally watch the plants as they sort of bend towards the sun. Okay? Now, am I exaggerating a little bit? Absolutely I am. However, now's your chance. You can see if I'm lying or not. You can, if you have a day where you're really bored, don't have a whole lot to do, not a whole lot of schoolwork to catch up on that day, put yourself out in the backyard on a nice sunny day and see if you can watch the plants bending with the sun. Plants do reproduce sexually. Okay, if you remember back in the beginning of the school year, we talked about sexual reproduction and we said it's not an act. Sexual reproduction simply means that there are two cells that unite, all right, to produce offspring. That would be usually the sperm and the egg. For plants, the sperm is the pollen grain, and they also have eggs. And plants have a very complicated life cycle. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, the plant life cycle is called alternation of generations. Okay, and just as the word implies, there are two generations that alternate back and forth. Okay, there's two stages to a plant life cycle. There's a haploid form that alternates with a diploid form. Well, all right, here we go. Let's review. All right, haploid and diploid. If you remember when we were talking about meiosis, we talked about haploid versus diploid. What does that mean? Haploid is abbreviated or as N, and diploid is abbreviated as 2N. Does this ring a bell? Okay, haploid means half the number of chromosomes. Diploid means a full complement of chromosomes that occur in homologous pairs. So if you remember when we were doing meiosis, we were talking about human haploid and diploid, and human gametes, the sperm and the egg, are the haploids that contain 23 chromosomes each, and when they unite through fertilization to form the zygote is diploid, which is 2N, that contains 46 chromosomes that occur in homologous pairs. Now, I can't say that plants have necessarily 46 chromosomes. That's going to vary based upon the species of plant that we're talking about. All right, but keep in mind, haploid is still the same. It's going to be the gametes, half the number of chromosomes, and diploid is going to be the same. When the gametes unite to form the zygote, it's going to have the diploid number of chromosomes, which means the chromosomes occur in homologous pairs. The first stage in alternation of generations is the gametophyte stage. This is the haploid form. Okay, now let's take a look at those two words. What word do you see in gametophyte? Well, hopefully you could see that gamete is in gametophyte. This is the stage of a plant's life cycle that produces gametes, which is the sperm, as I said before, the pollen grain, and the egg. The second stage is the sporophyte stage, which is the diploid form. Okay, so if this is the diploid form, hopefully you would see that the sporophyte is formed from the fusion of two gametes when the pollen fertilizes the egg of a plant. The sporophyte stage is actually the plant you see. So if you look out into your backyard and you have some big trees there, the tree that you're actually looking at is considered the sporophyte stage. And what word do you see in sporophyte? Hopefully you'd be able to answer. You see the word spore. And so therefore the sporophyte stage produces spores. Okay, the spores then develop into the gametophytes. All right, and this keeps going back and forth. You have the gametophyte stage produces gametes. They fuse to form a zygote, which is the sporophyte, and the sporophyte then is the plant that you see, produces spores, which then grow into the gametophyte, and it keeps going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Here's a pictorial representation of the alternation of generations. All right, this is just a basic diagram that shows you the two stages of the alternation of generations where the plants alternate between the diploid organism and the haploid organism. You can see the top half of this diagram is your sporophyte stage. All right, so the zygote grows into the sporophyte, which is 2N. The sporophyte goes through meiosis and produces the spores, which then produces, grows into the gametophyte, which then produce the gametes, and it just keeps going around and around and around like that. Now, we also said that plants are autotrophic, they're photosynthetic. Okay, well, what exactly is it that they need for this process of photosynthesis? Well, plants have 4 needs for photosynthesis. The first is they need sunlight. The second need that they have is water and minerals. The third need that they have is gas exchange. And the fourth need that they have for photosynthesis, is the movement of water and nutrients. As you can see in that pictorial depiction of the photosynthesis equation, you have sunlight. The plants take in carbon dioxide through their leaves, and again, this is something we're going to talk about as we continue on with plants. They absorb water and minerals by their roots from the ground, and then they use the sunlight, the carbon dioxide, and the water to produce glucose, their sugar, and oxygen. The oxygen will also then be released by the leaves, and then the sugar, the glucose, is stored in various places within the plant body. Now, plants can be divided into two divisions. Okay, the first division is called the vascular plants. Now, these are the most common type of plant, as you can see there. Vascular plants contain what's called vascular tissue for transporting food and water throughout the plant. Okay, these are, again, the most common type of plant. These are the plants that you would consider if I asked you to name plants for me: trees, flowers, bushes, things like that, ferns. Okay. And also, vascular plants have a special covering that covers the entire plant that prevents water loss, and that's called the cuticle. The cuticle is a waxy covering that prevents the water loss. If you think about, if you have ever looked at a leaf that has fallen off of a tree, you can see one side of the leaf is really shiny and smooth, and the other side of the leaf is really rough and dull. The shiny, smooth half of the leaf is covered with this cuticle. If you think about flowers, a lot of times the stems are shiny and smooth also, because those stems are covered with the cuticle. But the cuticle, again, it's just a waxy layer, but it prevents water loss in plants. And that's very important for plants, because all living things need water to survive, but plants particularly need water in order to survive. Okay? On the right-hand side of the screen there, you see I have an example of the alternation of generations for a fern. A fern is a vascular plant. All right, I'm not sure how many of you guys know what a fern looks like. Okay, but ferns are very easy to spot because of those leaves, those big leaves that they have. All right, they're called fronds. So they're leaf-like structures, actually. They're not necessarily leaves, but they are leaf-like structures, and they're called fronds. All right, and you can see the sporophyte stage there. All right, the 2N is those fronds, and on the underside of those fronds are spore cases in which the spores are released. And then those spores, okay, grow into that heart-shaped structure, which is the gametophyte stage. The gametophyte then releases the sperm and the egg, which fertilize usually in water or near water, okay? And then that zygote will grow into those fronds, which again, the cycle just continues over and over and over again. All right, the second division of plants are called non-vascular plants, and these are also commonly called bryophytes. They're non-vascular because they do not contain vascular tissue. Vascular tissue is very important in transporting food and water throughout the plant, okay? The vascular plants have vascular tissue, and that's what enables them to be tall, all right, to grow very tall away from the soil, and they don't necessarily have to live near a water source. Non-vascular plants, on the other hand, are relatively small. They grow close to the ground in dark, damp, moist places. Because they don't have vascular tissue, it does not enable for them to grow very tall, and they have to be close to a water source because they just absorb water, and it doesn't have to go very far because it doesn't have that vascular tubing to take water up from the ground up to the leaves and food back down. Okay, non-vascular plants need a lot of water to survive, all right, and they are anchored by root-like structures called rhizoids. Does that sound familiar? Rhizoids? All right, we were just talking about in our fungi study of Rhizopus, which is the common bread mold, and it's called Rhizopus because it has these root-like structures called rhizoids. So they are very similar. They're not exactly the same, but they are very similar. Okay, non-vascular plants do need to have a water source in order to reproduce because their sperm, the pollen grains, actually have flagella that need water to swim to the eggs. And the eggs actually have to be close to the ground and near the water source as well in order for the sperm to find them. All right, examples of non-vascular plants are moss, green algae, liverworts, and hornworts. Now, you might know what moss is, and again, hopefully you remember the green algae. Liverworts and hornworts might be something that you're not overly familiar with unless you have ponds or streams near your houses, okay? But here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see I gave a life cycle of a typical moss, all right? And again, you can follow, you see on the very bottom, there's the gametophyte, okay, which produces the gametes. Again, the sperm usually have flagella in that they need to swim to the egg cell. They fertilize, all right, and then the zygote will then grow into the sporophyte stage, which produces the spores that again grow into the gametophyte stage. You can see the rhizoids there, okay? Now, here's some pictures of some non-vascular plants. And again, this is for if you don't know what some of these guys look like. Like you can see the mosses there, you can see the liverworts, the hornworts, okay? Those are just some basic examples of some non-vascular plants. And again, a lot of times you wouldn't really necessarily sometimes think of these as being plants, but they are in fact plants. All right, so the vascular plants, since those are the most common type of plant, those of course are the most numerous types of plants that you have in the plant kingdom. Let's take a look then at vascular plants in particular, okay? We already said that the plant kingdom can be divided into two divisions. The vascular plants that have these vascular tissues inside for transporting food and water, and again, that's what enables them to grow tall. And then the non-vascular plants, which do not have the vascular tissue, which causes them to have to remain pretty small, and they also have to live near a water source. They have to be very close to water. Well, vascular plants themselves can also be divided into two separate categories. You have vascular plants without seeds, okay, and those would be your ferns, your club mosses, and your horsetails. And these two need to live near water for reproduction, because the sperm and the egg are carried by the water. So even though they have to live similarly to a non-vascular plant, they are vascular because they do have vascular tissue. They can grow taller than your mosses and your horntails and liverworts and things like that, or hornworts, excuse me, not horntails, but hornworts. But they do need to live near water because they too will have the flagellated sperm that needs water to swim to the egg. Okay, but then the most common type of plant, and these are the ones that you guys would think of, those are the vascular plants that reproduce with seeds. Okay, so these are the seeded plants. And of course, these are the ones that grow very tall, such as maybe trees that you have in your backyard. If you think about the redwoods out in California, those are the tallest trees in the world. Okay. These live in dry places. They don't necessarily need water for reproduction. They need water to survive and for photosynthesis, but they don't need water for reproduction. Okay, and these use both seeds and flowers for reproduction. But when we're talking about plant reproduction and we look at the parts of the flower, you're going to see how within the flower is where the seeds develop, and they're usually surrounded by a fruit. But other types of seed plants, the seeds are not necessarily covered by a fruit. Okay, they just produce the seeds. All right, now talking about seeds, what is it about seeds? Well, here's some pictures, of some seedless vascular plants. You can see there's ferns, okay, there's horsetails, all right, you can hopefully recognize clover, all right, so those are seedless vascular plants. And if you think about those, like especially the clover, they grow pretty close to the ground. You know, they're not very tall. They don't get very tall. Ferns, on the other hand, there are some species of ferns that can get huge. They can be really tall to the point where they almost look like trees. Those are sometimes ones you find down in the tropics. All right, so seeds. Seeds have three particular pieces to them. Okay, so the structure of seeds contain three things. They contain an embryo, which would be considered a partially developed plant, all right, or which is the partially developed plant that grows into the mature plant. They contain what are called cotyledons. These are also called an endosperm, and you'll see that on the next slide with the structure of the seed. Cotyledons can be defined as leaf-like structures that store and produce food for the embryo. I'm not really fond of the definition of a leaf-like structure because they really don't look like leaves that you would consider to be leaves, and you'll see that when we look at the diagram of the seed in the next frame. And then they are covered by a seed coat, which is the hard outer covering that protects the embryo. So the three main structures of all seeds are the embryo, the cotyledons, also known as the endosperms, and seed coat. All right, so what does this look like when we're looking at the inside of a seed? Well, here you can see that, okay? If you look at this diagram, it looks like a bean, okay? And you can see the embryo, which is that little green tiny plant that's found inside the seed. All right, and you see how the cotyledon or the embryo, or excuse me, the endosperm, it's that big portion of the seed itself. Okay, that's the food supply. It provides a constant source of food for the growing embryo. All right, if you broke open a kidney bean, you would see something like this. Now, the embryo may not necessarily be green, but if you broke open a kidney bean, you'd be able to see the embryo inside. All right, hopefully, we'll be able to get back to school and we can do just that. I'll soak some beans overnight, in which case then you guys can take a scalpel and break open different types of beans, and you can identify these different parts of a seed. And then, of course, you have the seed coat, which is the outer covering that protects the growing embryo and everything else inside the seed. Okay? Now, primary ways that seeds get dispersed is through wind, small animals, and insects. Okay, the wind can carry some seeds very long distances. Small animals can eat the seeds, and because the seed coats are so hard, they don't usually digest. They will go out the same way that they came in. So when animals and birds and such like that are, defecating, they can the seeds will come out the same way that they went in. And most animals don't chew the seeds, they swallow them whole. And so they're going to come out exactly as they are, and they're already there with its own manure for it to grow. Insects, larger insects can carry very small seeds with them. Now you probably know insects for pollination. However, they are able to spread seeds as well. Sometimes when they land on certain plants, the seeds will fall off, and wherever the seeds fall, they will grow. Okay. Now, germination is the name given for the process of the seed growing into an adult plant. All right. Now, this happens in a certain way. All right. You can see if we plant the seed there, the very first thing to grow is the embryo. And you can see how the embryo comes out of the seed and actually points down. All right. And that is gravity that does that. Okay. But it does point down. And so therefore the very first thing to grow from a seed is actually the roots. The roots is the part of the plant that stays under the ground. And the shoot is the part of the plant that you see above the ground level. And as you follow through this diagram, you can see as the roots begin to grow, the seed coat falls off. All right, you can see the cotyledons actually come up out of the ground, and the embryo grows out of the cotyledons. You see that? Okay, and that, guys and gals, is where we're going to end for today. All right, so let's recap a little bit of everything that we talked about today. We talked about general characteristics of plants. Okay, they have eukaryotic cells. They're solely autotrophic, meaning they're photosynthetic and they make their own food. Okay, we have two main divisions of plants. You have your non-vascular plants, which don't contain vascular tissue for transporting food and water. You have your vascular plants, which do contain vascular tissues to transport food and water, which enables for them to grow pretty tall. Okay, plants have a very complicated life cycle called alternation of generations, which you have your gametophyte stage, the haploid stage that produces gametes, that alternates with the sporophyte stage, the diploid stage that produces spores. And just remember, the sporophyte stage, folks, is the plant that you're usually looking at. Okay? Now, the vascular plants can be separated even further into two types of the seedless vascular plants and the vascular plants with seeds. And seeds have three main parts to them. They have a seed coat, they have an embryo, and they have the cotyledons, are also known as the endosperm. All right? All right, guys, hopefully this is pretty clear for you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me, and I will see you in the next video.